today's episode of Heard and Seen Around. I am Rajesh Karipurath. This is my take on macroeconomic and geoeconomic data points, which I find interesting. I hope you enjoy watching it as much as I enjoyed curating it. Cheers.
Life isn't short, it's just scheduled poorly. Progress is when we replace one set of problems with shinier ones. Nothing travels faster than gossip, except maybe a bad email sent to reply all. In business, experience is just the fancy word for, we tried that once. A budget is what you make when hope meets arithmetic.
Everyone says India should do what China did. Well, here's a catch. China did it with $1 trillion wallet. According to the IMF, Beijing has spent nearly 4% and 6% of GDP every year since 2011 on industrial subsidies. That's nearly $1 trillion annually. And these aren't just tax breaks. They're cash handouts, cheap land, and subsidized credit flooding factories, chip makers, and EV producers. In short, industrial policy with rocket fuel. For comparison, that's roughly 10 times what the US spends and miles ahead of what India can afford to spend. So no, India cannot replicate China's growth model. It has to innovate on its own. Because when your neighbor is sprinting on steroids, maybe it's smarter to run a different race. AI isn't just about transforming work, it's literally driving the US economy. In the first half of 2025, IT capex, mostly AI related, made one of the biggest contributions to GDP growth, outpacing even government spending and inventories. Call it Silicon Keynesianism, the private sector is doing what fiscal policy used to do. But here's the twist. Next year, that balance flips. Charts show fiscal impulse turns negative in 2025, higher taxes, lower spending, with a mild rebound only by 2026. So as Washington tightens its belt, Wall Street is betting that AI will keep the economy humming. The risk? If corporate capex cools, there is no government cushion left. In short, AI might be America's new stimulus, just without Congress voting on it. Bangalore just proved once again that it's not just India's tech hub, it's the youth capital of entrepreneurship. The Avengers Wealth Hurun India U35 list crowns Bangalore at the top, home to 54 young founders, including Shashank Kumar and Harshal Mathur of Razorpay fame. Next up, Bombay with 29, New Delhi with 22, then Gurgaon, Hyderabad, Noida, rounding off the top 6. Interestingly, San Francisco sneaks in too. Proof that India's entrepreneurial diaspora isn't limited by geography or time zones. From fintech to edtech to new age manufacturing, these under 35s aren't just starting up, they're reshaping India's growth story from co-working spaces and caffeine-fueled chaos. Call it what you want. Make in India, code in India, or just build fast, sleep later. Either way, the next billion-dollar idea probably has a Bangalore pin code. The world's startup scene still gallops to an American beat, but the herd is spreading. The US still remains the undisputed unicorn capital, home to nearly $800 billion startups. That's over half of the world's total. China follows with 284, and India takes the bronze with 88. Not bad for a country that barely had a handful a decade ago. But here's the interesting part. The trend line is shifting. Even as America leads, innovation is decentralizing, with new unicorn hubs popping up from Berlin to Bangalore, Singapore to Sao Paulo. The biggest names will read like a Silicon Valley who's who, SpaceX, ByteDance, but the next wave is going global and fast. Because in 2025, billion-dollar ideas don't need a Bay Area zip code, just Wi-Fi and audacity. Saudi Arabia isn't the only one quietly turning the oil taps back on. New data shows Iraq and the UAE are also ramping up crude output, and in the UAE's case, production might just be even higher than what official numbers say. Call it strategic compliance, OPEC style. Meanwhile, Kuwait is starting to lift production too, after months of restraint, while Saudi output edges higher from last year's voluntary cuts. Fact is that with oil prices being where they are, and with oil-producing nations having very little success in diversification of revenues, they have very little choice but to pump out more. Back in 2011, India and Vietnam looked almost identical in manufacturing. Each had the sector contributing roughly 17 to 18% of GDP. Fast forward to today and that story's flipped. Vietnam's manufacturing share has surged by nearly 10 percentage points, while India's has actually fallen by around 5. Vietnam turned itself into Asia's factory floor, luring global supply chains, electronic giants, and investment-friendly reforms. Meanwhile, India's manufacturing push stayed stuck somewhere between PowerPoint and policy paper. To be fair, India's industrial base is expanding in absolute terms, but not fast enough relative to its booming services sector. So while Vietnam's GDP hums with factory engines, India's still runs on code, credit, and consumption. The difference? One's exporting chips, and the other is still exporting PowerPoints. The third phase of China's outperformance over India quietly began in July 2025 and is showing up clearly in the MSCI China versus MSCI India charts. After lagging badly for much of 2024, Chinese equities have surged ahead again, helped by policy easing, cheaper valuations, and a wave of stimulus-driven optimism. Meanwhile, India's markets have cooled off, not crashing, just consolidating, as investors took profits after two blockbuster years. But here's the twist. These leadership swaps are becoming cyclical. China rallies on stimulus, India rallies on fundamentals, and the handover happens every few quarters. So yes, China is back in the lead, but in emerging markets, the baton never stays in one hand for long. So far, so good. India's trade flows have barely flinched, even as new tariffs and import duties make headlines. The data shows exports have been steady at around $440 billion and imports hovering near $700 billion, almost unchanged since late 2022. That means, despite all the noise, India's trade engine is cruising. No major collapse in exports, no import surge, just stability. It's not flashy, but in global trade terms, flat is the new strong, especially when everyone else is wobbling under slower growth and supply chain resets. Yes, the deficit remains large, but that's the cost of building. And India is still buying the capital goods it needs for its next phase of growth. After years of waiting, India's private capex cycle is finally waking up and is not hitting the snooze button this time. New data shows a sharp pickup across sectors. Power, metals, telecom, and even cement are ramping up investments again. The power sector alone has seen a 115% surge, a sign that India's energy transition is now backed by hard cash and not just big talk. Even IT, capital goods, and services, the classic laggards, are showing momentum with steady gains in investment share. It's early days, but the pattern's clear. Corporate India is spending again, building plants, upgrading tech, and expanding capacity. In short, the capex cycle is back, and this time it's not government-led. It's private money doing the heavy lifting. And that's when you know the recovery is real. India's smartphone export story looks spectacular. Shipments have more than doubled in 2 years, from $11 billion to over $24 billion. Smartphones are now India's top export, ahead of petroleum products, gems, and steel. But here's the twist. Almost all that growth is coming from one market, the United States. Shipments to the US hit $7.5 billion in just 4 months of FY26, nearly triple of last year's levels, while exports to the rest of the world actually fell 30%. That means India's smartphone success is now dangerously concentrated, built on one big customer, who is also threatening a 25% tariff on imports unless Apple and others move production home. So yes, India's smartphone factories are buzzing, but the export story still runs on one wire: Washington's goodwill.